Welcome. Today we're going to be looking at the seven dispensations, and we're going to be looking at each one in particular. So we're going to start with the first dispensation, often referred to as the dispensation of innocence. And so each dispensation occurred, it's not a time period. That's not what a dispensation is. It's an economy or an administration, but they all occur during time. And there's a beginning and an end time for each dispensation. So the dispensation of innocence began with the creation of man in Genesis chapter 1, where God said, "Let us make man in our image." When God made man, a new economy began for mankind. And that dispensation of innocence started at the creation of man, and it ended at the fall of man. So it was a very short period of time. We don't know how long. It could have been just a matter of days or weeks even. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, we're told that she ate of the fruit and gave to her husband Adam, and he ate, and sin entered the world. So that's the time frame from the creation of man to the fall of man. And in that time frame, God gave new revelation, and that was kind of the basis for this new economy or this new stewardship. And we read in Genesis chapter 2 that the Lord commanded the man, saying, "Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." So here was new revelation. Adam was told that he had liberty to eat whatever he wanted on the whole planet. He could eat from any tree he wanted except for one, and that was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was their law. That was their restriction. And also, God gave other revelation. In Revelation chapters 1 and 2, God also spoke of marriage in the home. From the beginning, marriage was intended to be one man and one woman for life. And God created Adam, and he brought to Adam a woman, Eve. And he brought them together as husband and wife. And he gave new revelation that the husband was to leave his parents and to cleave unto his wife, and they became one flesh. So this was a new revelation that God gave in this brand new dispensation. And so along with new revelation comes new responsibilities. And we also see in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, God said, "And let them," Adam and Eve together, "let them have dominion over all the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, over all the cattle, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So mankind, Adam and Eve, were to exercise dominion over the whole world. They were co-regents at that time. And they were God's representatives in his earthly theocracy, a government run by God through human representatives, or a human mediator, namely Adam and Eve. And we see also more responsibility was given to them. In Genesis 1 and verse 27, it says, "God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish or fill the earth, and subdue it." So here mankind was to fill the earth. They were to multiply, they were to have children, generations, they were to fill the earth, and they were also to subdue it. And subdue here means to bring into subjection, to take control over something. So God gave to Adam and Eve the responsibility to have dominion over the whole world and also to control it, to use it. They were to study the creation that God made. They were to discover principles, and they were to discover scientific laws, and they were to use that for the advancement of mankind and ultimately for the glory of God. And then we see another responsibility In Genesis 2:15, it says, "And the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it." So Adam had the responsibility to take care of the Garden of Eden. And this was his role. This was his responsibility. It was not a burden. Work was a delight before the fall. And we also see in Genesis 2:16 that Adam and Eve were forbidden to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was their responsibility. They didn't have 10 commandments. They only had one. And they were forbidden to eat from that tree. And we also read that out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called them, that was the name thereof. So Adam had the responsibility to be a scientist, and he was to name all the animal kingdom. He was to look at them and figure out the distinct character and nature and physical qualities of each one, and he was to give a name. He was basically to scientifically categorize the animal kingdom. But we know that the age of innocence, with its new revelation and new responsibility, ended the way every single one of the 7 dispensations ended, in failure, human failure, and divine judgment. Adam and Eve were created, in the words of Reynolds Showers, a good way of describing the way they were created. He described their nature as unconfirmed favorable disposition towards God. So they were created with a disposition that was favorable towards God. In other words, they were bent towards holiness. They were able not to sin. And that was the ruling factor of this dispensation. They were able not to sin. They were given one requirement, that they were not to eat of that tree, and they failed. Satan confronted Adam and Eve, the only 2 human beings, the first 2 human beings, and he confronted them with an alternative to God's plan. God's plan was live happily ever after in the Garden of Eden, just don't eat of that one tree. And Satan's alternative was, eat of that tree. It will make you wise. You'll be like God. The alternative was for Adam and Eve to reject God's rule and to insert self-rule, which is basically a perfect definition of sin. It is self-will contrary to the will of God. And that's exactly what Adam and Eve did. And they chose this alternative that Satan had presented to them. They chose not to remain favorably disposed towards God. And they displayed this, made a terrible choice by eating the forbidden fruit. And as a result, their favorable disposition towards God was bent and twisted. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, we read about Adam and Eve eating of that tree. Eve ate of it and gave to her husband, and he did eat. And in doing so, Adam chose death over life. They could have stayed in that garden and eaten of the tree of life and lived forever. But Adam chose to disobey God, and he ate of that forbidden tree. And the day that thou shalt eat thereof, God said, thou shalt surely die. So Adam had revelation from God. He chose to disobey what God said. You know, the New Testament tells us that Adam was not deceived. Paul wrote to Timothy. He sinned willfully against a revealed law, a revealed principle from God. And as a result, he sinned against the light that God had given him at that time, and he was now guilty of sin, and he was no longer innocent. And so the age of innocence ended when man lost his innocence by sinning. And as a result of man's failure, divine judgment took over. And we read in Genesis chapter 2, in verse 17, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thou shalt surely die. And so Adam and Eve were judged with death. They didn't die physically that day. They lived in the flesh much longer, but they died spiritually that day. They were cut off from fellowship with God, which must have been an unbelievable blow to them, that God would no longer have fellowship with them as he had in the past. We also read of their judgment in Genesis 3, verses 23 and 24, that God cast them out of the garden. They were forbidden to enter. Cherubim were placed there with swords to prevent that from happening. They could not enter into the garden ever again and eat of the tree of life and thus live forever in their fallen condition. So God in grace chased them out of the garden and forbade them from entering ever again. And we're told in Romans chapter 5 that Adam's death and Adam's sin and death and condemnation were passed on to all his descendants, for all were in Adam when Adam sinned. We also read of divine judgment in that dispensation. In Genesis chapter 3, God judged Satan. And God also judged the woman. And now childbearing, which should have been a delight, became very painful for a woman. And also the relationship between husband and wife, where the husband lovingly was the head over the woman, and the woman lovingly and graciously and willingly and freely submitted to his headship, that relationship was now broken. And the woman would now have a new desire to rule over her husband, but her husband would rule over her. And so the marriage relationship, which was perfect and sinless, was now affected and infected by sin. We also read that a curse came on Adam, and Adam was judged, and the curse fell upon the ground. And now Adam was, instead of tending to a garden, which was a true delight for him, now he would have to work, and it would be toilsome, it would be burdensome. If by the sweat of his brow the earth was cursed, and it brought up thorns and thistles. And the curse was not work, but the curse was that work would now be laborious and a burden to man and to mankind. And the whole earth was under a curse of God because of Adam's sin. In fact, Paul writes in the book of Romans in chapter 8 that the creature and all of its the entire creation was subject to vanity, not willingly. It wasn't creation's fault, but it was because of the sin of man. And now the whole earth, the creation, is under the bondage of corruption. And another aspect of this judgment was Adam and Eve lost their dominion over the world, and the theocracy ended. Now Satan had interfered, and Satan had now usurped their authority over the world, and Satan, by doing so, became the God with a small g of this world system. Adam and Eve were made co-regents, and now that rule was over. This was all divine judgment. And so in every dispensation, they all end in failure, and that's followed by divine judgment. The dispensation of innocence is certainly distinct from all other ages. And just for a minute, let's just consider how different life was, how different God's economy was, how the ruling factor in the lives of men were in that age as compared to the church age today. For example, Adam was created not as a sinner. He was able not to sin. Now, he was able to sin, and he did, but he was also able not to sin. He was favorably disposed towards holiness and towards God. He was innocent before the Lord. Adam had no sin nature. Certainly that's different. John tells us if any man says he has no sin nature, then he's a liar. We all have a sin nature. Adam thought only pure thoughts. He never thought anything evil before the fall. He did only things that were good. He had unhindered, uninterrupted, sweet fellowship with the Lord every moment of every day. He lived in an entirely perfect environment. In every way, it was perfect. He was totally, completely ignorant of evil and wickedness. It was not something that would ever come to his mind. He was made in the image of God. And he lived in an uncursed, beautiful world. When Adam sinned, his image was marred. It was distorted. Mankind still has the image of God today, but today it's not like it was in Adam's day. It was perfect, a perfect reflection of God's character in Adam. Today, or rather in Adam's day, Adam and Eve were co-regents over the whole world. They had dominion. They were God's representatives in the whole planet. In fact, they ruled it. They owned it. They were the only ones there. They had authority over everything in the world. And the animal kingdom was in perfect submission to both Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were vegetarians. They never would have thought of killing an animal. There was no death, much less eating it. All the animals, even lions and tigers, were herbivores. They ate only vegetables and grains. And God looked at everything in the world that day and he said it was very good. I don't think the Lord would say that if he looked at the world in its condition today. It's anything but very good. In that world, it never rained. There were never floods. A perfect mist came up from the earth and kept everything lush and watered. And so Adam dressed the garden. It was a delight every day to take care of the garden. And he loved it. Adam had no written laws, no commandments other than the one commandment about that one tree. Adam and Eve were both naked and they were not ashamed. There was no reason to be ashamed. They were man and wife. There was no one else around. And they had no sin nature to think evil thoughts anyway. You know, just think of all the organizations and institutions that men have created because we don't live in that kind of an environment today. We need armies, we need police and doctors and prisons and funeral homes and human government. Adam knew nothing of those institutions. They were not necessary in that age. And Adam had access to the tree of life. The tree was not yet forbidden. It was not yet guarded by the cherubim. So I think if we just read through these few chapters in the early part of Genesis, I think we'd all agree that the Lord's administration of his moral absolutes in that day, the way God administered the affairs of life on earth, was totally different. It was a distinguishable difference from the way God managed his world in generations to come. And it's certainly different than the church age today. So innocence was a unique economy, and that constitutes its own distinguishable dispensation.